I pulled into the Rocky Mountain National Park ranger station just before noon, my truck kicking up dust that caught the sunlight. The station looked like most I'd seen before, a sturdy log building with a green metal roof and the National Park Service shield mounted proudly above the entrance. After 15 years working as a ranger across parks from Yellowstone to Zion, I'd developed a routine for first days. Arrive early, meet the outgoing ranger, get the lay of the land, and settle in before dark. This posting was a lateral move for me, but one I'd requested. The Rockies in summer promised cooler temperatures than my last assignment in the Southwest, and I'd heard the backcountry sections needed experienced hands. The mountains rose around me, their peaks still holding patches of snow even in June. I'd always found something calming about mountains. Their solidity, their permanence. A man stood waiting on the station's porch, watching my approach with an intensity that struck me as odd. He was older, maybe late 50s, with gray hair poking out from under his ranger hat. His uniform was impeccable, despite the remote posting, but his face looked weathered beyond his years, deep lines carved around eyes that never seemed to stop scanning the tree line. I parked and grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat before approaching with my hand extended. "James Crawford," I said. "Everyone calls me Jim." The man's handshake was firm but quick, like he didn't want to linger in one spot too long. "Robert Mitchell, been waiting for you." His eyes darted past me toward the road, then back to the forest edge. "Glad you made it before the afternoon storms roll in." I glanced up at the clear blue sky. "Storms?" Forecast looked clear when I checked this morning. Robert ignored my comment. "Let's get you situated. I've got most of my gear packed already." Inside the station, he gave me a rushed tour. The space was simple but functional. A main office with radio equipment, maps covering one wall, a small kitchenette, and a bedroom and back with a bathroom attached. Everything looked clean but worn. The furnishings practical rather than comfortable. "You're getting a good sector," Robert said, though his tone suggested otherwise. 30 years I've worked this backcountry. Seen things most people wouldn't believe. He paused at his desk and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper from his breast pocket. "Everything you need to know about this place is in the standard manuals," he continued, "except for this." He smoothed the paper against the desktop and turned it toward me. I looked down at a handwritten list numbered 1 through 4. 1. Stay on the marked trails at all times. 2. If you see lights in the forest at night, do not follow them. 3. Do not acknowledge or speak to anyone wearing a suit. 4. There are no horses in this part of the Rockies. If you hear or see any, leave immediately. Robert watched me read the list, his face completely serious. "These aren't standard park guidelines, Crawford. These are survival rules I've developed over 3 decades in these mountains." I nodded politely, taking the paper. "Got it. Basic safety precautions." "No," he said sharply. "Not basic anything. I'm not talking about bears or mountain lions or getting lost. I'm talking about..." He stopped himself, rubbing a hand across his face. "Look, just follow them. Each one of those rules cost me something to learn." I folded the paper carefully, keeping my expression neutral. Internally, I was already categorizing Robert as one of those old-timers who'd spent too many years alone in the wilderness. Every park had at least one. Rangers who'd been isolated so long they started seeing patterns in random events, assigning meaning to coincidence. "First one makes sense," I said, trying to be diplomatic. "Always good to stay on trails." Though any experienced ranger knew sometimes you had to go off-trail for rescues or wildlife management. Robert seemed to read my thoughts. "I mean it. No exceptions, not even for official business. Radio for backup if you need to leave the path." "And the lights?" I asked, unable to keep a hint of skepticism from my voice. "Northern lights sometimes reflect off the snowfields," he said. "Or that's what they want you to think. They look beautiful. People follow them. Those people don't come back." I nodded again, wondering if he was referring to some local search and rescue incident that had gone bad. Maybe there was a logical explanation behind his warnings, wrapped in superstition. "The man in the suit," I prompted. Robert's eyes hardened. "You'll know him if you see him. He shows up miles from any road, always in a black suit, always facing away from the trail. He'll look lost or hurt. Your instinct will be to help him." He leaned forward. Don't call out, don't approach, don't even look at him too long. Just turn around and go back the way you came." This was getting stranger by the minute. I'd encountered confused hikers before, sometimes dangerously unprepared for wilderness conditions. But Robert was describing something that sounded more like a ghost story than a ranger's report. "And the horses?" I asked, remembering my wildlife management training. "There aren't wild horses in Rocky Mountain National Park. The ecosystem doesn't support large herds." "Exactly," Robert said, his voice dropping. "There are no horses here. So if you hear galloping, or see anything that looks like a horse, you get the hell out of that area immediately. Don't investigate, don't take pictures. Just leave." He stared at me with such intensity that I found myself nodding despite my disbelief. The man clearly believed what he was saying, even if it sounded like the product of too many years of isolation. "I'll keep it in mind," I said, tucking the paper into my pocket. Robert seemed to deflate slightly. "You think I'm crazy, they all do at first." He turned away and resumed packing his personal items into a cardboard box. "I'm just trying to make sure you last longer than the other replacements." "Other replacements?" I asked. "3 in the last 2 years," he said without looking up. "None of them stayed more than a month. The Park Service doesn't tell new arrivals that part." I leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "And why did they leave?" "Ask them if you can find them," Robert said cryptically. He sealed his box with packing tape and lifted it. "I've got 2 more in my truck, then I'm done with this place forever." I helped him carry his remaining boxes out to an aging Ford pickup. The entire time, his eyes kept moving, scanning the tree line, checking the sky, never staying still. It was the behavior of someone who felt hunted. "You got family waiting somewhere?" I asked as he closed the tailgate. His expression softened slightly. "Sister in Denver. Going to stay with her a while, then maybe head to Arizona. Somewhere flat. Somewhere I can see what's coming from a long way off." He climbed into his truck and started the engine, then rolled down the window. "That list I gave you, keep it with you. Memorize it. Maybe you'll be smarter than I was." I raised a hand in farewell. "Safe travels, Robert. Thanks for the orientation." He gave me one last look. "The mountains are beautiful, Crawford, but they're not just mountains." With that cryptic statement, he put the truck in gear and drove away, tires crunching on the gravel. I watched until his vehicle disappeared around a bend, then turned back to the station. The silence felt heavy after he left, broken only by birdsong and the whisper of wind through the pines. I pulled out the crumpled note and read the rules again, shaking my head at the old man's paranoia. 30 years alone in these mountains would make anyone a little strange, I reasoned. The isolation, the harsh winters, the responsibility of patrolling such vast wilderness, it could wear on the steadiest mind. I balled up the paper and tossed it onto the passenger seat of my truck. I'd seen my share of odd things in national parks over the years, but nothing that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena or human behavior. I spent the next hour unpacking my gear and settling into what would be my home for at least the next year. The station felt different with Robert gone. Quieter, but somehow less tense. I checked in with park headquarters by radio, confirming my arrival and receiving my first week's patrol schedule. By mid-afternoon, I was ready to get a feel for my new territory. I changed into my hiking boots, filled my water bottle, and grabbed my park map. The Moraine Park area was listed as my primary responsibility, a beautiful valley carved by ancient glaciers, surrounded by mountains and filled with meadows, forests, and a meandering river. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as I hiked along the main trail. The path was well maintained, winding through stands of aspen and pine, occasionally opening to reveal breathtaking views of the valley and distant peaks. I passed a few groups of tourists heading back toward the main visitor areas, exchanging friendly nods. My training kicked in automatically as I hiked, noting trail conditions, checking for wildlife signs, and mentally mapping emergency access points. This was familiar work, the kind I'd done for 15 years across some of America's most challenging parks. Whatever strange notions Robert had developed about this place, I felt confident that my experience had prepared me for anything these mountains could offer. As the sun dipped lower, I turned back toward the station, planning my route for the next day's patrol. I'd start early, make a complete circuit of the Bear Lake Trail, then work my way through the more remote sections. A proper exploration, methodical and thorough. That's how I'd always approached a new posting. Back at the station, I made a simple dinner and spread the sector maps across the desk, tracing potential routes with my finger. My radio crackled occasionally with routine communications from other park areas, but my section remained quiet. I glanced at my truck parked outside, remembering the crumpled list I'd tossed there earlier. Stay on the trail. Don't follow the lights. Don't talk to the man in the suit. Stay away from the horses. I smiled to myself. Robert's rules wouldn't be necessary. I had science, experience, and training on my side. Whatever had spooked the old ranger for all those years, I was sure it had a perfectly rational explanation. As darkness fell completely outside the windows, I finalized my plan for tomorrow's patrol and headed to bed, falling asleep to the distant hooting of an owl from somewhere in the forest. I woke just before dawn, the unfamiliar ceiling of the ranger station coming into focus as my alarm chirped. After 15 years of early mornings, my body was programmed to rise with minimal complaint. The owl I'd heard last night had gone silent, replaced by the first tentative calls of morning birds. My muscles ached pleasantly as I stretched and got out of bed. New posting, new mattress, that was always the way. I'd adapt within a week. I pulled on my uniform, made a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, and studied the maps one more time while sipping black coffee. The Bear Lake Trail would be my first proper patrol, a popular hiking area that looped around one of the park's most visited lakes. I packed my standard gear: first aid kit, extra water, radio, flashlight, multi-tool, and park literature for any tourists with questions. The morning air felt crisp and clean when I stepped outside, the kind of mountain freshness that made me glad I'd requested this transfer. My truck started with a familiar rumble, and I noticed the crumpled piece of paper on the passenger seat. Robert's list of rules. I hesitated, then tucked it into my jacket pocket. Not because I believed the old man's warnings, but because it seemed disrespectful to throw it away completely. The drive to the Bear Lake trailhead took about 20 minutes through winding mountain roads. I passed only 2 other vehicles, early hikers getting a jump on the day. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, just how I liked it. The sun had cleared the eastern peaks, casting long shadows across the landscape and giving everything that golden morning glow. I checked in with headquarters via radio, letting them know I was beginning my patrol. Crawford starting Bear Lake Circuit copy? Copy that, Crawford. Weather looks good today. Check in when you finish. The trail started off wide and well-maintained, with educational signs about the alpine ecosystem posted at regular intervals. I moved at a methodical pace, noting trail conditions, checking for any maintenance issues, and scanning for wildlife signs. This was standard ranger work, peaceful, purposeful, and predictable. After about half an hour, I'd covered less than a mile. The trail meandered significantly, winding back and forth along the lakeside and through stands of pine and aspen. My efficient, practical mind started to chafe at the slow progress. Through a gap in the trees, I could see where the trail curved widely to avoid a small rise, adding at least a quarter mile to the journey. Just beyond that rise was the next section of trail, a straight shot across that would save significant time. I paused, considering. The terrain between looked perfectly navigable, a beautiful grove of aspen trees with relatively clear ground underneath. My GPS showed my position clearly and the destination was obvious. What was the point of strictly following the trail when I could cut across and save 20 minutes? I was an experienced ranger, not some tourist who might get disoriented. Robert's first rule floated through my mind: stay on the marked trails at all times. I smiled to myself. The old man's paranoia was excessive. I'd gone off trail hundreds of times in my career for completely valid reasons. Wildlife tracking, search and rescue, maintenance checks. Nothing bad had ever happened. Decision made, I ducked under the rope barrier and headed into the aspen grove. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. I maintained a straight line toward where the trail should resume, keeping my bearings with practiced ease. About 50 yards in, I noticed the light change subtly. I looked up, expecting to see clouds passing over the sun, but the sky directly above remained clear blue. Yet somehow, the forest had dimmed, as if twilight were falling. I checked my watch, barely 8 in the morning. 10 more steps, and the first wisps of fog appeared around my ankles. This caught my attention immediately. Fog wasn't unusual in mountain environments, but it typically formed in valleys or near water sources during specific temperature conditions, not suddenly in a dry aspen grove on a clear morning. I continued forward, telling myself it was just a pocket of cooler air. The fog thickened with each step until it reached my knees, then my waist. The aspens around me became hazy outlines, their white bark almost luminous in the mist. I pulled out my GPS unit to verify my direction, but the screen showed no signal. I frowned and shook it, then tried moving it higher. Nothing. The device had been working perfectly just minutes ago. Piece of junk, I muttered, tucking it back into my belt. The fog continued to thicken until I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The trees all looked identical now, pale sentinels in a white void. I turned to head back to the trail, but realized with a sinking feeling that I couldn't tell which direction I'd come from. The fog had erased my footprints, and the uniform forest offered no landmarks. I took a deep breath, fighting down a flicker of unease. This was basic wilderness navigation. The trail had been running roughly north-south, and I'd headed east. All I needed to do was turn west and walk until I hit the path again. I pulled out my compass and found the needle spinning wildly, never settling on a direction. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. "This isn't possible," I said aloud, my voice strangely muffled by the fog. Then I heard it, my own voice, coming from somewhere in the mist to my left. "This isn't possible," it repeated, the intonation exactly matching what I just said. I froze, heart suddenly hammering. "Hello?" I called out, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Hello?" came the reply from a different direction, again in my own voice. Training kicked in, overriding the primitive fear response trying to take hold. I forced myself to think logically. Sound can play tricks in fog. It was probably just an echo effect caused by the density of the air and the arrangement of trees. Nothing supernatural about it. I started walking in what I hoped was the direction of the trail, moving carefully through the thick mist. The visibility had dropped to less than 5 feet now. The aspens loomed out of the whiteness like ghostly figures appearing suddenly and then vanishing behind me. Just a weather phenomenon, I told myself. Localized fog bank. Happens all the time. Happens all the time, my voice answered from somewhere ahead. I changed direction, following the sound. Maybe it was an actual echo bouncing off something solid, which could indicate the edge of the forest or a rock face near the trail. "Hello, anyone there?" I called out louder. "Anyone there?" The response came from behind me now. This continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Every time I called out, my voice would answer from a different direction. Every time I followed the sound, I found only more trees and thicker fog. I was walking in circles, disoriented in a space that should have been no more than 100 yards across. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air. My rational mind kept offering explanations. Unusual acoustic properties, a microclimate weather event. But they were starting to sound hollow even to me. I sat down on a fallen log, trying to calm my racing thoughts. This was when people got lost in wilderness areas, when they panicked and made bad decisions. I needed to be smarter than that. My hand brushed against something in my jacket pocket, the crumpled piece of paper Robert had given me. I pulled it out and stared at the first rule again. Stay on the marked trails at all times. The old man's warnings suddenly seemed less like paranoia and more like hard-earned wisdom. Whatever was happening, I needed to get back to the trail. That was the priority now. I stuffed the paper back in my pocket and stood up. Instead of calling out or trying to find a specific direction, I simply started walking in a straight line, counting my steps. After 100 paces, I would turn 90 degrees and walk another 100. Using this grid pattern, I reasoned, I would eventually cross the trail. "Going somewhere, Jim?" my voice asked from the fog, so close it could have been whispering in my ear. I ignored it, focusing on counting my steps. The voice called again, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing. I kept walking, kept counting. On my third grid line, my foot hit something solid, a wooden boundary marker. Relief flooded through me as I recognized the trail's edge. I scrambled over it, back onto the marked path. The fog vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. I stood blinking in bright sunlight, the morning exactly as clear and beautiful as it had been before. The aspen grove looked completely normal, no fog, no strange shadows, just trees and dappled sunlight. My GPS signal returned instantly, showing I'd been less than 70 yards from the trail the whole time. I looked at my watch. Only 35 minutes had passed since I'd left the path, though it had felt much longer. The experience had been so disorienting that I struggled to process what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Was there some natural explanation for what I'd experienced? I pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink, trying to steady my nerves. Whatever had happened, I'd made it back to safety. The trail felt solid and reassuring beneath my boots. I completed my patrol, sticking rigidly to the marked path for the rest of the morning. Every time I passed a shortcut opportunity, I remembered the disembodied voice calling my name and kept walking the long way around. My scientific mind continued searching for rational explanations, but found none that completely satisfied. By the time I returned to my truck in the early afternoon, I'd convinced myself that I must have experienced some kind of stress reaction, perhaps altitude sickness causing minor hallucinations, combined with an unusual weather phenomenon. The human mind could play tricks when placed in unfamiliar environments. Still, when I slid into the driver's seat, the first thing I did was retrieve Robert's crumpled note from my pocket. I smoothed it out carefully on the dashboard, reading each rule again with new eyes. 1. Stay on the marked trails at all times. 2. If you see lights in the forest at night, do not follow them. 3. Do not acknowledge or speak to anyone wearing a suit. 4. There are no horses in this part of the Rockies. If you hear or see any, leave immediately. The first rule had proven itself today, whatever the explanation. I folded the paper neatly this time and placed it in my breast pocket, where I could access it easily. As I drove back to the station to complete my reports, my mind kept returning to the second rule. Lights in the forest at night. What kind of lights? What happened if you followed them? Robert hadn't explained, and I had dismissed him too quickly to ask. The scientific part of me, the part that needed to understand and categorize the world, wasn't satisfied with simply following rules without knowing why. Perhaps the fog had been a fluke, a one-time event that would never happen again. The only way to know for sure if Robert's warnings had merit was to test them systematically. I made my decision as I pulled up to the ranger station. Tonight, I would conduct my scheduled patrol around Sprague Lake. And if I happened to see any unusual lights in the forest, well, that would be an opportunity to put Robert's second rule to the test. I pulled into the ranger station parking lot just as the sun dipped behind the western peaks. The interior light flicked on as I opened the door, illuminating the folded piece of paper on my dashboard. Robert's rules. I picked it up and read it again, focusing on the second item. If you see lights in the forest at night, do not follow them. After my experience in the aspen grove that morning, I was less quick to dismiss the old man's warnings. The rational part of my brain kept searching for explanations, a pocket of fog, an unusual acoustic phenomenon, but nothing quite fit what I'd experienced. The scientific method demanded testing, and tonight's patrol would give me that opportunity. I went inside the station and logged my afternoon report, careful to omit any mention of disembodied voices or strange fog. My official account noted only standard observations, trail conditions, visitor contacts, wildlife sightings. The paperwork took about an hour, during which I ate a quick dinner and prepared for my night patrol. Sprague Lake was on my schedule for this evening, a small, scenic body of water popular with photographers for its mountain reflections. Night patrols were standard procedure, checking for unauthorized campers or visitors after hours, monitoring wildlife activity, and ensuring park regulations were followed even in darkness. I gathered my gear, flashlight, radio, first aid kit, extra batteries. I hesitated, then folded Robert's list and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Not because I believed it, I told myself, but as a reference point for my investigation. The drive to Sprague Lake took about 15 minutes on empty park roads. The visitor parking lot was deserted when I arrived, just as expected. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and the distant hoot of an owl. My watch read 9:30. I grabbed my flashlight and started my routine check of the area. The wooden boardwalk that circled part of the lake creaked under my boots. Water lapped gently at the shore, and the mountains stood as dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky. Everything felt normal, peaceful. For the next 2 hours, I made regular circuits of the lake and surrounding area, checking the picnic shelters, restrooms, and trailheads. I spotted a few deer drinking at the water's edge and a raccoon digging through an improperly secured trash can. But no human visitors. Standard night patrol stuff. Around midnight, I was making what would likely be my final circuit before heading back to the station. I'd almost convinced myself that Robert's warnings were nothing more than the ramblings of an isolated mind. Almost. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought they were fireflies. Pinpricks of bluish light floating between the trees about 50 yards off the main trail. But fireflies weren't common at this elevation, and these lights moved with purpose, not the random dance of insects. They bobbed and weaved through the darkness, sometimes dimming, sometimes brightening, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. I stood frozen on the trail, watching them. They were beautiful against the dark backdrop of pine trees. Soft, cerulean orbs that seemed to pulse with gentle energy. I counted at least a dozen, moving in loose formation through the forest. Bioluminescent fungi, I murmured to myself, or maybe swamp gas reflecting off temperature inversions. Even as I spoke, I knew neither explanation made sense. The conditions weren't right for either phenomenon. Besides, since when did fungus move like that? Robert's voice echoed in my mind. They look beautiful. People follow them. Those people don't come back. I shook my head. This was exactly why I needed to investigate, to find the rational explanation behind these local legends. I was a trained ranger with 15 years of experience, not some superstitious tourist. I clicked off my flashlight to better see the lights and stepped off the trail. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, muffling my footsteps as I approached the lights. They seemed to notice my presence, clustering together and retreating slightly deeper into the trees. Not running away exactly, more like inviting me to follow. "Just a little closer," I whispered, pulling out my phone to take a picture. The camera couldn't seem to focus on the lights, producing only blurry, dark images no matter how I adjusted the settings. I pushed through a tangle of undergrowth, keeping my eyes fixed on the blue glow ahead. The lights maintained a consistent distance, not so far that I'd lose sight of them, but always just beyond reach. I tried changing my approach angle, moving more quickly, even calling out to them, but the result was always the same. They stayed tantalizingly ahead of me. My radio crackled with static, making me jump. I reached down to adjust the volume, and when I looked up again, the lights had rearranged themselves into a rough line, like runway lights guiding me deeper into the forest. Some small voice of caution in the back of my mind suggested I should head back to the trail. I'd gone at least 100 yards into unmarked territory now, farther than I'd intended. But the lights were so close, and the mystery so compelling. Just a little farther, I told myself, just until I could get a proper look at what was causing them. Time seemed to stretch as I followed the blue orbs through the increasingly dense forest. I checked my watch at one point and was surprised to see that 20 minutes had passed since I'd left the trail. I should turn back, I thought, but what if the explanation was just ahead? The lights picked up speed, and I did too, crashing through underbrush and ducking under low-hanging branches. They were leading me somewhere specific, I realized. Not random movement at all, but a deliberate path. Then, without warning, they vanished, not fading out, but disappearing between one heartbeat and the next. I stopped short, blinking in confusion. Where dense forest had surrounded me moments before, I now stood at the edge of a small clearing I didn't recognize. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied, a perfectly circular open space about 30 feet across, ringed by trees so tall and close together they seemed to form a wall. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding flat and muffled. No answer came. No echo returned. The silence was absolute. No rustling leaves, no insects chirping, no distant owl calls. Nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam around the clearing. The ground was bare earth, not a single plant growing in the circle. My light caught something at the center, what looked like a crude arrangement of stones. I took a step toward it. That's when I heard it. Breathing, slow and deliberate, not my own. It came from the trees directly across the clearing. Deep, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations like something massive conserving energy. Something watching me. I swung my flashlight toward the sound. For a split second, the beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. Not the familiar green or yellow eyeshine of a forest animal, but a deep, cold blue that matched the vanished lights. I stood paralyzed as a massive shadow detached itself from the darkness between the trees. It rose up and up and up, easily 8 feet tall, probably more. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but wrong in fundamental ways that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. The proportions were distorted, the limbs too long and jointed in extra places, the head too large and oddly shaped. The thing made no sound beyond its breathing as it took one ponderous step into the clearing. The moonlight caught it briefly, revealing not skin, but something like black smoke held in a roughly human shape, edges constantly shifting and reforming. A primal part of my brain screamed at me to run, but training kicked in. Fast movements trigger predator instincts. I forced myself to back away slowly, one careful step at a time, never turning my back on the creature. It cocked its misshapen head as if curious, then took another step forward. I continued my retreat until my back pressed against the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. The creature raised one impossibly long arm, fingers extending like smoke tendrils toward me. That's when I broke. Training or no training, self-preservation won out. I turned and crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about noise or direction, focused only on putting distance between myself and that thing. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, but fear kept me moving faster than I'd ever run before. I had no idea how long I ran or in what direction. My lungs burned and sweat plastered my uniform to my skin despite the cool night air. Finally, miraculously, my foot hit the packed dirt of a trail, not the one I'd left, but a marked path nonetheless. I stopped, bent double, hands on my knees as I gasped for breath. When I could finally stand upright again, I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight in all directions. Nothing followed me, at least nothing I could see. But I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the darkness beyond the trail's edge. My hands shook as I pulled out my GPS unit. I was on the Fern Lake Trail, nearly 2 miles from where I'd started at Sprague Lake. That was impossible. I couldn't have covered that much ground, even running. The forest didn't work that way. Distances didn't work that way. But then, nothing about tonight worked the way it should. I began walking quickly along the trail, keeping my flashlight beam directed at the path ahead, refusing to look into the forest on either side. The watching sensation followed me for nearly a mile before gradually fading, like a radio signal growing weaker with distance. By the time I made it back to my truck, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. I'd spent the entire night in the forest, though it had felt like only a couple of hours. My uniform was torn in several places, and scratches covered my hands and face from my headlong flight through the underbrush. I sat in the driver's seat, doors locked, staring out at the now ordinary-looking forest. With shaking hands, I pulled Robert's list from my pocket and read the second rule again. If you see lights in the forest at night, do not follow them. Such simple, clear instructions. Why had I been so determined to prove them wrong? I drove back to the station slowly, my mind replaying the night's events on endless loop. No matter how I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, no scientific explanation fit. The lights had deliberately led me to that clearing. The thing in the darkness had been waiting for me. For the remainder of my shift, I stayed religiously on marked trails, checking over my shoulder constantly, hand often straying to the pocket where I kept Robert's list. The paper had become more than just an old man's paranoid ramblings. It was a survival guide for a place I was only beginning to understand. When my relief arrived that afternoon, I handed over a report detailing normal patrol activities. I mentioned nothing about blue lights or breathing shadows or impossible distances. Some things couldn't be put in official reports, not if I wanted to keep this job or my reputation for mental stability. As I prepared to get some much-needed sleep, my radio crackled with a new assignment for the next morning. A hiker had reported seeing a man in a business suit standing alone near Trail Ridge Road, miles from any parking area or logical reason to be there. I barely slept after my encounter with the lights and the shadow creature in the forest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cold blue orbs floating between the trees, leading me towards something that should not exist. My bedroom at the ranger station felt too quiet, too still, as if the world outside was holding its breath, waiting. The sun had just cleared the eastern peaks when my radio crackled to life, startling me from my half-asleep state. "Crawford, you copy? Over." I grabbed the radio from my bedside table. "Crawford here. Go ahead. We've got a report from a hiker about a man in a business suit standing near mile marker 17 on Trail Ridge Road. Apparently he's just standing there, not moving." Hiker was concerned. "Can you check it out? Over." My stomach tightened. Robert's third rule rushed back to me. Do not acknowledge or speak to anyone wearing a suit. Did the hiker say how long the man had been there? Over. I tried to keep my voice casual. Said they noticed him on their way up the road and again on their way back down an hour later. Same spot, same position. Sounds like he might need help. Over. Copy that. I'll check it out. Crawford out. I set the radio down and sat on the edge of my bed, running a hand through my hair. After what I'd seen last night, the idea of approaching someone in a suit standing alone in the wilderness made my skin crawl. But I couldn't ignore a potential visitor in distress. I dressed quickly, clipping Robert's list to the inside of my jacket where I could reference it easily. This was my job after all. People got lost in national parks all the time. Maybe this was just some confused hiker who had wandered away from a tour group. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation. The drive to mile marker 17 took about 25 minutes. Trail Ridge Road wound along the mountainside, offering spectacular views of valleys and peaks stretching to the horizon. In any other circumstance, I would have enjoyed the scenery. Today I barely noticed it. I spotted him immediately after rounding a bend. A man in a black suit stood about 30 yards from the road, facing away from me toward the vast expanse of mountains. Even from this distance, something about his stillness seemed wrong. People shift their weight, adjust their stance, move with their breathing. This man was completely motionless, like a photograph of a person rather than the person himself. I pulled over and parked on the shoulder, leaving the engine running. Through my windshield, I studied the figure. His suit looked expensive. Perfectly tailored, crisp lines. Not a wrinkle despite the mountain wind that should have been tugging at the fabric. His black hair was neatly combed, not a strand out of place. He stood at the edge of a steep slope that dropped hundreds of feet to the valley below, yet showed no concern for the dangerous position. Every instinct told me to drive away. But what if he was a real person in trouble? What if he was having some kind of medical episode that caused him to freeze up? I couldn't just leave without checking. Robert's warning echoed in my mind. If you see anyone wearing a suit, don't acknowledge them. Don't speak to them. Turn around and leave immediately. I compromised. I would keep my distance but call out to offer assistance. If this was a real person in distress, they would respond. If not, well, I'd deal with that if it happened. I stepped out of my truck but stayed near the door. Hello? Sir? Are you all right? I'm Ranger Crawford. Do you need assistance? No response. Not even the slightest movement to indicate he'd heard me. Sir, National Park Service. Are you in need of help? Nothing. The wind picked up, whistling through the nearby pines, but the man's suit and hair remained perfectly still, as if the wind passed through him rather than around him. I waited, watching. 5 minutes passed. Then, 10. The figure never moved, never gave any indication he was aware of my presence. I'd seen people in shock before, but nothing like this. I'm going to call for medical assistance, I called out, one last attempt at communication. Please let me know if you can hear me. Again, nothing. I got back in my truck and picked up my radio. Base, this is Crawford at mile 17 on Trail Ridge Road. I'm going to need medical assistance for a possible... I trailed off, unsure how to describe what I was seeing. For a possible medical emergency. Subject is unresponsive to verbal communication. Copy that, Crawford. What's the nature of the medical emergency? Over. I looked back at the figure, trying to form an appropriate response, and felt my blood turn to ice. The man had turned around. I hadn't seen him move. No rotation, no steps, nothing. One moment he was facing away from me, and the next he was facing directly toward me, though still standing in exactly the same spot. But what made my hand freeze on the radio was his face, or rather the absence of one. Where features should have been, eyes, nose, mouth, there was only smooth, featureless skin, like a mannequin that had yet to be painted. Crawford, please clarify the nature of the emergency. Over. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the blank face. As I watched, the head tilted slightly to one side like a curious dog. Though it had no eyes, I felt it studying me, assessing me. I dropped the radio and threw the truck into drive. "False alarm," I said quickly, pulling back onto the road. Appears to be nothing. Crawford out." I accelerated down the mountain road, checking my rearview mirror constantly. The figure remained where it stood, faceless head tracking my departure. I drove well above the speed limit until I could no longer see it in my mirrors, then pulled over at a scenic overlook to catch my breath. What the hell had I just seen? My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. That thing hadn't been human. Couldn't have been human. The blank face, the unnatural stillness, the way it had turned without moving, none of it fit any explanation I could come up with. Robert's warnings had been right on target so far. The trails had their own rules. The lights were not to be followed. And now I knew why you didn't acknowledge the man in the suit. But what was it? What would have happened if I'd approached it? I shuddered, grateful I hadn't found out. I continued my patrol, forcing myself to focus on normal ranger duties, checking trail conditions, noting wildlife activity, speaking with hikers. The routine helped calm my nerves, though I kept finding my hand straying to my jacket pocket to touch Robert's list through the fabric, reassuring myself it was still there. By early afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself I could finish my shift without further incident. I headed back to the ranger station to complete some paperwork before my evening patrol. As I pulled into the small gravel lot beside the station, my eyes landed on a figure standing beside my parking spot. A man in a perfectly tailored black suit, facing away from me. My foot instinctively hit the brake, stopping the truck 20 yards from the station. It was the same figure from Trail Ridge Road. I was certain of it. Same suit, same build, same unnatural stillness. But it couldn't be. That spot was at least an hour's drive from here, and I'd taken the only direct route back. I sat frozen in my truck, engine idling, unsure what to do. The figure stood closer to the station than I was comfortable with. If I wanted to get inside, I'd have to pass within feet of it. As I watched, without any visible movement, the figure turned to face me. The same blank, featureless face stared in my direction. Though it had no eyes, I felt its attention fixed on me with terrible intensity. The head tilted again, that same curious gesture. Then, with no transition, the figure was 2 steps closer to my truck than it had been a moment before. I hadn't seen it move. It simply was closer now, like a video that skipped frames. My heart pounded against my ribs. I put the truck in reverse, preparing to back away, when the radio crackled. "Crawford, this is Benson at HQ. Just checking if you completed your inspection at Trail Ridge Road. Over." I grabbed the radio with sweaty hands, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure. "Benson, I'm at the station now. There's a..." I paused, unsure how to describe what I was seeing without sounding insane. "There's a situation here. I'm going to relocate temporarily. Over." "What kind of situation, Crawford? Do you need backup?" "Over." The figure took another impossible step closer, now only about 15 feet from my truck. "Negative on backup," I said quickly. "I'm handling it. We'll report in later. Crawford out." I dropped the radio and threw the truck into reverse, backing out of the lot as fast as I dared. The figure remained where it stood, blank face turned toward me. As I pulled onto the main road, it took another sudden step forward, now standing at the edge of the lot where my truck had been moments before. I drove without any clear destination, just wanting to put distance between myself and that thing. After about 20 minutes, I pulled over at a roadside rest area. Other cars were parked there, tourists taking photos of the mountains, and their presence comforted me. Nothing supernatural would approach with so many witnesses. I took out Robert's list again, reading the 3rd rule. Do not acknowledge or speak to anyone wearing a suit. I'd acknowledged it. I'd spoken to it. And now it seemed to be following me, appearing impossibly at locations miles apart. What did it want? What would have happened if I'd gotten closer? One thing was becoming painfully clear. Robert Mitchell hadn't been suffering from isolation-induced paranoia. He'd been trying to save my life. Each rule on his list was a hard-earned lesson, probably learned the same way I was learning them now, through terrifying first-hand experience. I glanced at my watch. 2 more hours until the end of my shift. I couldn't avoid the station forever, but I wasn't eager to return while that thing might still be waiting. I spent those hours conducting unnecessary patrols of heavily trafficked areas, taking comfort in the presence of tourists and other park staff. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to go back to the station, face whatever might be waiting there. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the lot, braced for the worst, but the area around the station was empty. No figure in a black suit, no blank face staring at me. Just the normal, peaceful scene of my small ranger outpost against the backdrop of mountains. I approached cautiously, scanning in all directions before hurrying inside and locking the door behind me. The station felt secure, but I found myself checking out the windows repeatedly, expecting to see that faceless figure standing in the growing darkness. What would tomorrow bring? The suited figure had found me once. Would it find me again? And what about the 4th rule on Robert's list? There are no horses in this part of the Rockies. If you hear or see any, leave immediately. I hadn't encountered any horses yet, but after the past 3 days, I had no doubt that when I did, they would be nothing like any horses I'd seen before. I sat in my truck at the ranger station, unable to move. The suited figure stood just 20 feet away, its blank face aimed directly at me. My knuckles went white on the steering wheel as I stared back, afraid to drive away and equally afraid to stay. After my radio call with Benson, I'd circled back to the station, hoping the thing would be gone. Instead, it waited exactly where I'd last seen it, totally still in the gathering darkness. I cut the engine but left the keys in the ignition, ready for a quick escape if needed. Minutes stretched into a full hour. The figure never moved, never approached, just stood there with its featureless face directed at me. What did it want? Why hadn't it come closer? I remembered Robert's warning not to acknowledge it, which I'd already broken. Maybe speaking to it had invited its attention, but not its immediate attack. The moon rose over the trees, casting pale light across the gravel lot. I checked my watch. Nearly 10 p.m. now. My shift had technically ended, but I couldn't bring myself to exit the truck with that thing standing guard. I jumped when my radio buzzed. "Crawford, HQ here. Everything all right? You never checked in after your situation. Over." I picked up the radio without taking my eyes off the figure. "HQ, this is Crawford. Situation is contained. Just finishing up some observations. Over." "Copy that. Remember your morning briefing at 0700. Over and out." When I looked back up, the figure was changing. Its edges grew fuzzy, its once solid form becoming transparent like morning mist. Over the next minute, it simply faded until nothing remained but empty space where it had stood. I stayed put for another 20 minutes, watching the empty spot before finally stepping out of the truck. The night air was cool on my face as I approached the area where the suited figure had been. The gravel looked undisturbed. No footprints, no sign anything had stood there at all. Inside the station, I locked all the doors and windows, then drew the blinds. I heated a can of beef stew, ate mechanically, and tried to make sense of what was happening. The trails that trapped you in fog and echoed your voice. The lights that led you to waiting shadows. The suited figure that appeared miles from where it should be possible to travel. And now Rule 4, the horses that didn't exist. Sleep came in restless bursts, broken by dreams of blank faces and blue lights watching me through the windows. I woke at dawn, exhausted but oddly determined. I couldn't hide in the station forever. Whatever was happening in these mountains, I needed to face it. But on my terms, following Robert's rules as closely as possible. After my morning briefing, which thankfully took place by radio, I decided to patrol the far end of my sector near Moraine Park. It was the most open, exposed area in my territory. Few trees, excellent visibility, and popular enough that other people would likely be around. Safety in numbers, I thought. The morning passed uneventfully. I chatted with hikers, checked trail markers, and documented wildlife sightings, normal, everyday ranger duties that helped restore some sense of normalcy. By early afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself that staying in these mountains was manageable if I just followed the rules. I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook, eating a sandwich while perched on a boulder with a view of the valley below. Moraine Park spread out beneath me, a vast meadow cut through by a winding stream. The mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still holding patches of snow despite the summer warmth. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and for a moment, I remembered why I'd wanted this assignment. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves. The rhythm was familiar to anyone who spent time around horses. That distinctive four-beat pattern, powerful and urgent. But it was impossible. Robert had been clear in his fourth rule. There are no horses in this part of the Rockies. If you hear or see any, leave immediately. The sound echoed through the trees to my right, moving parallel to the trail I sat beside. I looked in that direction, but saw nothing through the pines. I should leave. That was the rule. That was the smart thing to do after everything I'd experienced. But a stubborn part of me wanted proof, actual physical evidence that would make sense of all this. Horses were real, normal animals. If I found horses, maybe that would mean Robert had been wrong about some things. Maybe not everything in these mountains was supernatural. I slid off the boulder and started walking toward the sound, still on the marked trail. The galloping grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like multiple animals moving in perfect unison. My hand moved to my jacket pocket, feeling the outline of Robert's list. I knew what it said. I knew I was breaking another rule. But horses, actual horses, could be explained. Maybe a park ranger mounted patrol from another sector. Maybe a sanctioned trail ride I hadn't been informed about. The sound veered deeper into the forest. If I wanted to find its source, I'd need to leave the trail. After my experience in the aspen grove, that should have been enough to stop me. But curiosity pushed me forward, step by step, until I ducked under the trail marker rope and entered the trees. This time, no fog appeared. The forest remained clear and normal as I moved between pines, following the thundering sound of hooves. I'd gone about 50 yards when I spotted movement through the trees ahead, large shapes moving with fluid grace. I slowed my pace, crouching slightly as I approached. Through a gap in the trees, I caught my first clear glimpse and froze in shock. 6 horses moved in perfect formation through a small clearing, their bodies illuminated by dappled sunlight breaking through the canopy. But these weren't living horses. Their flesh had long since rotted away, leaving only bleached bones held together by some unnatural force I couldn't understand. Their rib cages were empty, allowing light to pass through to the forest floor beneath them. Their hooves made no contact with the ground. They floated several inches above it, despite the thundering sound I could hear. Most disturbing were their skulls. Empty eye sockets burned with pale blue fire that matched the lights I'd followed nights before. Blue flames also flickered along their spines and rippled through their exposed rib cages like spectral manes. I pressed myself against a tree trunk, trying to process what I was seeing. The skeletal horses moved with impossible precision, turning in unison without any signal I could detect, maintaining exact distances from each other as if connected by invisible rails. The sound of galloping continued to fill the air, but I realized now that the noise came from nowhere. The hooves of these creatures made no sound at all as they moved above the forest floor. The thundering was separate from them, like a recording playing to announce their presence. One horse suddenly stopped, while the others continued their formation. It turned its skeletal head toward me, the blue fire in its eye sockets brightening. I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air wash over me, seeping into my bones. The creature's jaw dropped open in what might have been a silent scream or laugh. No sound emerged, but something else did. A wisp of blue flame that curled out like smoke, hanging in the air between us. I backed away slowly, remembering how running had triggered the shadow creature's pursuit. The skeletal horse watched me retreat, its flaming eyes tracking my movement. When I'd backed about 20 feet away, the horse rejoined its companions. The entire group simply vanished, there one moment and gone the next, taking their terrible galloping sound with them. The forest returned to normal summer sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. I might have believed I'd imagined the whole thing if not for a lingering smell of charred bone and a patch of blackened, dead grass where the horses had passed. I stumbled back toward the trail, no longer caring about stealth or dignity, just wanting to reach the safety of the marked path. When my foot hit the packed dirt of the trail, I nearly collapsed with relief. Back at my truck, I sat with the engine running and the doors locked, staring at Robert's list which I'd placed on the dashboard. 4 rules, 4 encounters, 4 warnings I'd ignored or tested, each time barely escaping. Rule 1. Stay on marked trails at all times. The fog and disembodied voices had nearly trapped me. Rule 2. If you see lights in the forest at night, do not follow them. The blue orbs had led me to the shadow creature. Rule 3. Do not acknowledge or speak to anyone wearing a suit. The faceless man had found me miles from where I'd first seen him. Rule 4. There are no horses in this part of the Rockies. If you hear or see any, leave immediately. The skeletal horses with burning eyes had noticed me, singled me out. I finally understood that these weren't suggestions born from an old man's paranoia. They were survival instructions for a place where normal logic didn't apply, where the natural world overlapped with something else entirely. Robert had tried to warn me, had probably seen the same things or worse during his 30 years in these mountains. Now I knew why he'd been so eager to leave, why his eyes had constantly scanned the tree line, why his face had carried deep lines of stress and fear. Now I understood why 3 rangers before me had lasted less than a month each. The mountains were beautiful, but they weren't just mountains. They contained things that defied explanation, entities that followed their own alien logic. And Robert's rules were the only barrier between a ranger and something far worse than getting lost or injured. I started the truck and drove back to the station, suddenly grateful for its solid walls and locked doors. Whatever was happening in these mountains, I was caught in the middle of it now. I couldn't leave. This was my post, my responsibility. But I would follow those rules to the letter from now on. No more tests, no more doubts. No more curiosity that put me in harm's way. Robert Mitchell hadn't been crazy. He'd been right about everything. I drove back to the ranger station as the sun set behind the mountains. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel. Every shadow among the trees made me flinch. Every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. The skeletal horses with their burning blue eyes had been the final proof I needed. These mountains held secrets that science couldn't explain. The roads were empty as I made my way back, the lack of other vehicles suddenly sinister rather than peaceful. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the faceless man in the suit standing in the middle of the road behind me, or those bone horses galloping in my wake. But there was nothing. Just darkening sky and the endless trees. When I finally pulled into the gravel lot beside the station, I turned off the engine but didn't immediately get out. Instead, I pulled Robert's list from my pocket and smoothed it out on the dashboard. The paper was getting worn at the creases from how often I'd unfolded and refolded it. I read each rule again, this time with new understanding. Stay on marked trails at all times. If you see lights in the forest at night, do not follow them. Do not acknowledge or speak to anyone wearing a suit. There are no horses in this part of the Rockies. If you hear or see any, leave immediately. 4 rules. 4 encounters that had nearly killed me. 4 warnings I'd tested because I thought I knew better. The difference between Robert and me wasn't that he was paranoid. The difference was that he'd survived 30 years in these mountains because he'd learned to respect what lived here. I'd been here less than a week and had nearly died 4 times. I reached into the glove compartment and took out a pen. Without hesitation, I added a 5th rule at the bottom of the list. Don't get curious. I stared at my addition. It seemed too simple, but it captured everything I'd done wrong. I'd heard the strange echo in the aspen grove and pressed deeper instead of retreating. I'd seen the lights and followed them into the forest. I'd approached the suited figure when I should have driven away. I'd gone looking for the source of impossible hoofbeats. Each time, curiosity had nearly gotten me killed. Inside the station, I locked the door behind me and checked every window, making sure they were secure. The radio on my desk crackled, startling me. "Crawford, this is HQ. Come in for end-of-day report." I picked up the handset, trying to keep my voice steady. "HQ, this is Crawford. Sector is secure. Assisted 3 hiking groups, documented 2 elk sightings and 1 black bear at safe distance from trails. No incidents to report. No faceless men. No skeleton horses. No living shadows. Some things couldn't be explained in official reports." "Copy that, Crawford. Get some rest. We'll have your assignments for tomorrow at the usual time. HQ out." I set the radio down and sank into my chair. How had Robert managed 30 years of this? How many times had he made similar bland reports while hiding the truth of what he'd seen? In the small kitchenette, I heated water for coffee, needing the caffeine despite the late hour. While waiting for the water to boil, I took out Robert's list again and studied it. The paper was beginning to look ragged from handling. If I was going to keep these rules close, I needed something more durable. I dug through the desk drawers until I found what I needed: a small lamination pouch and the laminator used for making temporary park passes. Carefully, I placed the worn paper inside the plastic sleeve and ran it through the machine. When it emerged, the rules were sealed behind a protective layer, preserved and waterproof. Using a hole punch, I made a small opening at the top and threaded a clip through it. I attached it to my uniform where I could see it at all times, a constant reminder of what waited in the forests and mountains around me. The kettle whistled, and I prepared my coffee, black and strong. Sitting at the small table, I stared out the window at the darkening forest. The mountains looked peaceful in the twilight, majestic peaks against a purple sky. It was hard to believe they harbored things that defied explanation, entities that followed their own alien logic. But they did. And Robert's rules, our rules now, were the only barrier between a ranger and something far worse than getting lost or injured. I thought about calling headquarters, requesting a transfer. I could make up a reason: family emergency, medical issue, anything to get out of these mountains. But something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or a sense of duty. This was my post now. If I left, someone else would come, someone who wouldn't have Robert's warnings. Would they survive long enough to learn the rules on their own? As night fully claimed the forest, I prepared for the next day. I checked my flashlight batteries, filled my water bottle, and made sure my first aid kit was complete. I laid out my uniform for morning and set my alarm. The radio crackled again with the next day's assignments: trail maintenance on the western ridge, a safety presentation for a school group at the visitor center, routine patrol of the lake area, normal ranger duties in a place that was anything but normal. I took one last look at the laminated rules clipped to my jacket before turning in for the night. As I lay in bed, listening to the night sounds outside my window, I made a silent promise to Robert, wherever he was now. I would follow his rules. I would survive. And if the time came when another ranger replaced me, I would make sure they understood exactly what waited for them in the darkness between the trees.